Hello, friends, and welcome back to Breaking Bread for You with a Bible study on David and his wives, specifically Michal, Ahinoam, and Abigail, his first three. And let me say that if you are a fan of King David, you might be challenged by my critical assessment of this Bible hero in regard to his relationships with women. And although David was recognized by the prophet Samuel as a man after God's own heart, when it came to marriage, he fared no better than many of us, 1 Samuel 13:14. So in examining David's 8 marriages, you likewise might recognize the disparity between the just and righteous David and David, the political animal, who used women in his ascent to the throne. But keep in mind that the Bible is not about its heroic characters, but about the revelation of their Creator, Jehovah, and his plan of salvation for mankind, and that the scriptures do not even suggest that we glorify any of the illustrious characters portrayed therein, regardless of how great and mighty they may have been, but that we glorify Almighty God, to whom all honor and blessings belong. Yet many fixate on the Bible heroes and heroines, the exemplars of faithfulness, justice, and righteousness, even creating demigods out of them, as has been the case with King David. And many hold on to the image of David as a young shepherd boy turned mighty warrior who took down the giant Goliath with just one stone, while ignoring his dark side, which reveals that he was all too human and fallible. And the one area where David fell short was in marriage, as marriage was meant to be, biblically speaking, that is, the union of one man with one woman for life. That said, let us begin to look at David's first marriage to King Saul's youngest daughter, Michal, from the book of Samuel, chapter 18. And having been impressed with David, King Saul promised him his oldest daughter, Merab. But for whatever reason, the king changed his mind and gave her to another man. Instead, Saul promised David his youngest daughter, Michal, whom we are told loved David, 1 Samuel 18:20 and 28. But there were strings attached to this bride beyond a dowry, which David could not afford, verse 23. And beginning in verse 25, Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servant told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as wife. Now, nothing is said here or elsewhere that David loved Michal and was pleased to have her as his wife. That is, as much as he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law, mentioned twice here, which assumes that David regarded marriage to the king's daughter as a way into the royal family and eventually to the throne. And sensing David's ambition and his growing popularity with the people and with his own children, Saul became fearful and hateful towards David, doing all that he could to eliminate this threat to his monarchy. But Saul's children, Michal and Jonathan, loved David, defended him to his father, and as the result, almost lost their lives. Michal put her life on the line by helping David escape when her father attempted to kill him, and then she lied about it all, saying that her husband had coerced her by threatening her life, 1 Samuel 19:12. And Jonathan defended David to his father and saved his life from his murderous attempts. Although Michal saved his life, David never sent for her, with some suggesting that he had not done so due to being on the constant move from one hideout to another while escaping from Saul. Yet David could have left her in the care of the king of Moab, as he had with his parents when he and his brothers began to run from Saul, 1 Samuel 22:3 and 4. From which it can be taken that David abandoned his first wife. And sometime later, David married Abigail the Carmelitess and Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. And when word of David's marriages got back to Saul, the king married Michal off to Paltiel, a Benjaminite of Galim, in order to cut off David's royal family ties, thereby blocking his ascent to the throne. But for Michal, her marriage to Paltiel turned out to be a happy one. That is until 10 years later, when Saul and his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua were killed in battle, and David became king. Yet Saul had another heir to the throne, Ishbaal, whom David had to deal with in order to have full rights to the throne. So he made peace with him, contingent on him turning Michal over to him, not because he loved her, but because, as he said, he had fulfilled the bride price of 100 Philistine foreskins. In other words, Michal was his possession, a political pawn he could use in securing his right to the throne. Sadly, David had Michal and Paltiel torn from one another, and she remained captive in David's harem for the rest of her life. So we can say of Michal's life that she was a political pawn for her father, King Saul, as well as for her husband David. So why did David not resume his marital relationship with Michal? Perhaps it was because she despised the king for breaking up her happy marriage to Paltiel, and/or for having berated him for dancing wildly while wearing a linen ephod, the garment of a Levitical priest, as they took the ark through the gates of Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 6:14 through 20. So this begs the question of why David was wearing a priest's ephod, assuming that Samuel was correct in his description of David's attire. If you will recall, King Saul was harshly rebuked by the prophet Samuel for offering up a sacrifice before battle, that which was strictly performed by Levites. And since David was not a Levite, he could not have assumed the position of priest, even due to a lack of them on that occasion, which was not the case at all. So if Michal's anger was due to David assuming the role of priest, evident in his wearing the ephod, which she knew was forbidden in Mosaic law, in all fairness, her rebuking David was justifiable. And I quote their heated conversation from 2 Samuel 6:20, where Michal said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, uncovering himself today in the eyes of the maids of his servants, as one of these base fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." So David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will be even more undignified than this and will be humble in my own sight. But as for the maidservants of whom you have spoken, by them I will be held in honor." So it appears that she was angry over his lack of clothing, that is, having uncovered himself before the ark of all things, and dancing exuberantly, being witnessed by servant girls, which in light of David's persona as a rough man of war should not have surprised her. And for those of you who take it that she overreacted, just think of your pastor dancing exuberantly up the aisle in his skivvies and how quickly ushers would escort him out, even in charismatic settings. And I close this section by saying that David's heated response might have been the last words he ever spoke to this royal princess. So let us move on to the story of David's second marriage to Abigail the Carmelitess, which at first read can be taken as a romance novella. Yet it is unlikely that romance was what this relationship was all about. Now, the account of their meeting begins in 1 Samuel 25, verse 2, with David and his militia in the Carmel region, where they encounter the servants of Nabal, the wealthy Calebite from Maon in Judah, who had flocks in Carmel. And so David offers protection to his servants who were sharing the sheep. And for guarding against lions, wolves, and robbers, David expects compensation in the way of food for his men from Nabal. So David sends 10 messengers to appeal to Nabal, who rudely replies, and I quote him beginning in verse 10, "Who is David and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from?" So David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came and told him all these words. And of course, David is not going to take Nabal's refusal and orders his men, and I quote, "Every man gird on his sword." So every man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. Verse 13. Now Nabal had a wife named Abigail, of whom it is said of both back in verse 3, "And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance. But the man Nabal was harsh and evil in his doings." So when one of Nabal's servants told Abigail that her husband had refused David, who had well protected them, and that they were on their way to avenge, Abigail in her wisdom took swift action. And beginning in verse 18 it says, "Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And she said to her servants, 'Go on before me. See, I am coming after you.' But she did not tell her husband Nabal. So it was as she rode on the donkey that she went down under cover of the hill. And there were David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, 'Surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him. And he has repaid me evil for good. May God do so, and more also, to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning.'" And here David reveals his dark side, determined to kill Nabal's innocent servants in order to avenge their master's foolishness. And in stark contrast, Abigail responds, "On me, my lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your maidservant. Please let not my lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now, therefore, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed, and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek harm for my lord be as Nabal. And now this present which your maidservant has brought to my lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my lord an enduring house, because my lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days. Yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he shall sling out, as from the pocket of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord has done for my Lord, according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. And then Abigail puts in a good word for herself after she has prophesied over David, saying, "But when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant," verses 24 through 31. And David, whose heart is softened by her actions, responds to her, saying, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed, and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely by morning light no males would have been left to Nabal." So David received from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have heeded your voice, and respected your person." And so Abigail returned to Nabal, whom she found drunk, and waiting until the next morning, she tells him all that she had done for David. And becoming rageful, Nabal had a cardiac arrest, leading to his death 10 days later. And then it is said in verse 39, "So when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal on his own head.'" And then David did what we would expect him to do with the wealthy and wise Abigail. He sent for her to marry her. And without haste, she ran to him, and they were married. And why wouldn't David marry Abigail? After all, Nabal was a very wealthy Judahite, owning a good deal of land in Judah. So David had much to gain, not only in material assets, but political standing in Judah, where he established his capital in the city of Hebron. 2 Samuel 2:1-3. And so it appears that this was another of David's political marriages. And in all fairness to David, Abigail wasted no time in accepting his proposal, which this pawn might have assumed would lead to becoming his queen. Yet, as far as the scriptures reveal, Abigail never became anything other than one of David's many wives. And the account of David and Abigail ends in 1 Samuel 25:43 with, and I quote, "David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and so both of them were wives." So it is to ask, where did Ahinoam come from? What was her parentage? And why is there no story about their meeting and marriage? Perhaps the consensus that David's Ahinoam was the same Ahinoam married to King Saul, 1 Samuel 14:15. Others say that there are two Ahinoams, differentiated by the designations Ahinoam the daughter of Ahimaaz and Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. Yet the fact that David's wife's parentage is omitting, using instead of her place of origin, it is possible that Samuel was whitewashing David's marriage to Saul's wife. However, there is a problem with this, in that if David's Ahinoam was Saul's wife, she most likely would have been the mother of David's wife Michal, which would mean that David not only committed adultery by marrying Saul's wife, who was still living at the time, but that he married his mother-in-law, both of which relationships are forbidden in Mosaic law, Leviticus 18:17. Yet those who take it that David's wife Ahinoam was Saul's wife base that on the prophet Nathan's rebuke of David for the Bathsheba debacle, and I quote him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you," meaning the monarchy, "and your master's wives into your arms." 2 Samuel 12:7-8. And if David took Saul's wives and or his concubines when he ascended to the throne, he would have been in line with the royal practice at that time. If you recall, David's son Absalom had sexual relationships with his father's 10 concubines while attempting to usurp his throne. 2 Sam 16:22. However, as a man after God's own heart, David should have followed Mosaic law, in which kings are forbidden to have multiple marriages, Deuteronomy 17:17, not to mention forming with foreign nations alliances sealed with foreign brides. And about the 10 wives accounted for in 2 Samuel, besides the most notable, Michal, Ahinoam, Abigail, and Bathsheba, there was Maacah, the daughter of the king of Geshur, of the territory east of the Jordan, an obvious political marriage. And then there was Haggith, Abital, and Eglah, 3 other of his wives in Hebron we know nothing about. Yet we are told that David took more wives when he moved his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem, 2 Samuel 5:13. Then we are told that he had an unknown number of concubines, 2 Samuel 6:21, and 1 Chronicles 3:9. It is to wonder if David recognized that multiple marriages and/or concubinage were not blessed, beginning with Abraham and Hagar, from which union Ishmael was born, whose descendants to this day are a thorn in Israel's side. And he certainly must have realized that in his own marital relationships, such as when his wife Ahinoam's son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, who was murdered by Tamar's brother Absalom. Maacah's son Absalom was killed by General Joab for attempting to usurp David's throne, and Haggith's son Adonijah was killed by his half-brother Solomon for his attempt to take the throne when David died. Now much more is said about Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, beginning in 2 Samuel 11. Bathsheba was the mother of 4 sons, Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. And this relationship was David's greatest failing as a righteous and just monarch, for she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier whom David caused to be killed in battle in order to cover up Bathsheba's illicit pregnancy. Now, did David love Bathsheba beyond having lusted over her, taking a bath on a nearby rooftop? Well, I take it that David never really loved any of his wives as he should have, perhaps due to his close relationship with Jonathan, King Saul's son. And I quote 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. Now when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house any more. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. Verses 1 through 4. So David and Jonathan deeply bonded to one another, finding soulmates in each other, as youth can do. And when David was fleeing for his life from Saul's attempt to kill him, it is said, David rose from beside the stone heap and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. David wept the more. Then Jonathan said to David, Go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. 1 Samuel 20, 41 through 44. And when David heard of Jonathan's death, he lamented, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. 2 Samuel 1:26. And due to this last statement, it has been suggested that David and Jonathan were lovers. I disagree with that and take it that they were deeply bonded to one another, nothing more than brotherly love. And evidently, David never experienced that depth of love with any woman, perhaps due to an irrational loyalty to Jonathan. And so in the absence of it being said that David greatly loved any of his women, it is plausible that he used them for sexual pleasure and political advantage. And about that political advantage, early on, David thought that such was necessary in his ascent to the throne and control over the land. And in all fairness to him, it cannot be imagined the pressures he endured through it all. However, David might have realized later on that in doing as he had, that he was chasing after the wind, attempting to make things happen the way the world operates, instead of trusting in Jehovah to bring all that was promised to him to fruition. And I say that based on what Samuel concluded, and I quote him, So David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. 2 Samuel 5:12. So how can we apply all of this to our lives? Well, for one, we can be assured that we don't need to transgress God's commandments to achieve all that we think we need to achieve in this life for the sake of the kingdom of God. and that the Lord who promised us to never leave us nor forsake us will provide all that we need to accomplish all that he has predestined us to achieve. Some of you might remember the verse, "Trust and obey, there is no other way." And so I thank you for subscribing to my channel and for viewing this lengthy Bible study. May Jehovah bless you in every area of your lives as you faithfully follow him, trusting in him for all things as you grow in the knowledge of the Lord, and that your destiny is fulfilled through him.